Mental illness is like air. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's all around us.
On today's show, we're going to take a little turn. We're actually going to be talking about mental illness, and you'll find out later in the video series what relationship this has to do with pets. But today it's very important to learn the history of air, attitudes in reverse, with my special guest, Kurtis Baker. As always, if you like what you see, don't forget to hit subscribe and listen to us live every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. on 107.7 The Bronx. Kurtis Baker joins me. Every year they have this great dog walk, and we'll get into the history and the details of that. And we'll talk about what Kurt and Trish do all the time, and it's just an amazing, amazing story. So, Kurt, thanks for joining me, and he's smiling at me.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Kurt, just for our listening and viewing audience, let's talk about AIR and how AIR stands for Attitudes in Reverse. And why don't we talk about the history of AIR, because I think it's incredibly important.
Sure, yeah. AIR is, as you pointed out, stands for Attitudes in Reverse. And it started off with a phrase our daughter, Caitlin, came up with to say about people's attitudes towards mental health disorders. She goes, she basically said something along the lines that mental illness is like air. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's all around us. And it was really, that phrase was really about the fact that so many people didn't understand mental health disorders while Kenny was struggling and after he passed. And the way that they treated the entire process of him trying to get better and trying to get treatment. He went essentially from a very popular kid to somebody who people didn't associate it with as much, and that had to do somewhat with his disorder and the fact that he was struggling a little bit and couldn't do all of the social activities he'd done in the past. And then after he passed, many people didn't understand, really couldn't talk about Kenny. We didn't really talk about what he struggled with. And the fact of the matter was many other students in the school were suffering with their own mental health disorders, as well as the loss of one of their classmates. So there was just a lot of layers of stress happening, and not identifying or recognizing, I should say, the issue and then addressing it head on is not a good way to handle any kind of problem, frankly, and especially when you're dealing with a mental health disorder. And that's really where this all started. And so they said mental illness is like air. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And we figured AIR would stand for something to reverse the attitudes about it. So that's where Attitudes in Reverse came from. Really kind of change people's perception about what mental health disorders are and also what they are not, and not to be afraid about discussing it directly, whether or not you have the disorder or the 80% roughly of the population who doesn't directly deal with mental health disorders, but is impacted indirectly or directly by those around them. So it really affects everybody.
Yeah, and it's amazing because I think in that time, so we're talking 9-10 years, right? We're talking of time frame of when all this began?
That is correct. This May the 19th is now the 9th anniversary of Kenny's passing. So, yeah, 9 years. We were literally thrown into advocacy that day. And that really has to do with the fact that a couple things were happening. One, we were part of that 10% that actually knew Kenny had a mental health disorder before he passed by suicide, which is actually interesting in of itself. But so we kind of understood what was happening. And the day of Kenny's passing, it was actually a public death. So the newspapers were calling our neighbors, asking them, what kind of was going on? What basically did the Baker family do wrong? Essentially, they're trying to sell media. So, unfortunately, media is a business as well as an information venue. So you have to understand whenever you're listening to media or watching media that they have their own agenda in addition to getting out news. So you really got to be paying attention whenever you listen to anybody talking, right? Whether it's media or it's an individual, just kind of understand where they're coming from. There have been several deaths similar to Kenny's. He died by train, which was public, and there have been other deaths nearby in Monmouth County, and they thought there was a story and some kind of trend that was going on. So the long and the short of it was one of our neighbors called us that was being reached out to, because our number is unlisted. We don't have a listed phone number. So that was they couldn't call us directly. So they called our neighbors. And on that phone call, we had to think about this. Of course, we just lost Kenny a few hours ago. We lost him in the middle of the night. This was now, you're talking 7, 8 o'clock in the morning probably is when this all started happening. And we just happened to have a friend of ours who was in the media out in California and continues to write even to this day locally. Is a very close friend of ours. So we called her and said, well, what should we do? And so the long and the short of it is she called the media outlet up and essentially talked to them and said, hey, look, you can write the story, but the Bakers would like to tell the real story, so to speak. So we were really and so what ended up happening is they wrote this story. They kind of toned it down a little bit. It wasn't quite so dramatic as far as the hype goes. It was much more accurate, we think, because we were involved in talking about it. And we also told the story of Kenny's struggle and all the roadblocks and things that we came across when trying to get him help. He had been hospitalized 6 times. He was diagnosed back when he was 16 years old. So 15, 16. So we had a lot of things going on. So we were a family that was pretty well aware of how the system works and how it doesn't work. And because we literally tried everything. We were at the highest. We had very, very good insurance. We had back then what you call Cadillac insurance. It had all the bells and whistles. It had residential placement benefits. It had all of that stuff. Plus, we were at the highest level of care on the state level, which in theory, we should have had success. So on paper, if you saw what was being done as far as from a services perspective, we should have had success. Unfortunately, we just believe that Kenny was a tough case. Just like cancer, you've got, we cure a lot of cancer these days, but still we haven't figured them all out. And unfortunately, we still do lose people, fewer. And that's kind of where mental health is going. We have a lot, we're getting better and better at success. And the sooner people get engaged in their treatment and finding solutions, the better, which is one of the things we really try to advocate for. And that's why we do what we do.
I got to tell you, Kurt, every time I hear this story, I learn something new. And I think that any listener or viewer out there, what you need to know about the Bakers is that because of what they're doing, the general populace is now much more aware of what's going on. We can talk statistics a little bit later about the average incidence of mental health issues in the school system alone, let alone in the general populace. And it's all about making people aware.